All right, so this is week 2 of the study we're doing on the seven-headed beast of Revelation 13. Of course, that's just the main focus. Obviously, I think in order to understand the seven-headed beast, its significance as a symbol, we have to go beyond just chapter 13 and the specific imagery here and see the connections. And so, what I want to do is um, as we review, we're going to just continue to add more material in connection with this. And so I'll just start with the basic information we looked at last week. As we looked at this chapter, Revelation 13, which begins with this description of a beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns. And I'm omitting certain details about it. I'm more interested in the things that I think are particularly important to the big picture. I'm not talking about where the crowns are at or anything like that. That we could talk about that in a subsequent study or some other time, but we're going to get the basics down first. And so what we're told is that the beast has 7 heads, it has 10 horns, and it is like a leopard. It has the mouth as of a lion and feet as of a bear. And then we know that it has 7 heads, right? So I've mentioned that several times, but each of the features of this beast, as it's described here in Revelation 13, verses 1 through 3, are correspondent to the exact animals that Daniel lays out in Daniel chapter 7, with the exception of the 7-headed component. The leopard, lion, bear, and 10-horn reference are each of those 4 a reference to one of 4 beasts that Daniel uses as imagery. The book of Daniel uses as imagery to depict what are explained to us to be kings and kingdoms. And in both Daniel chapter 7 and in Revelation 13, it explains that these beasts arise out of the sea or out of the earth. And the Daniel uses those terms like interchangeably almost. There may be some more significance to it, but you have to get deeper than just noting. In one instance, it might say sea, in the other case, it says out of the earth, because Daniel indicates in verse 3 that they arise out of the sea, and then in verse 17 it says out of the earth. So there's seemingly more there to do than just say, oh well, sea means this and earth means that, when they seem to be used interchangeably. But there could be more there. So in Daniel, we have these 4 beasts: the lion, the leopard, the bear, the leopard, and the 10-horn beast. So we don't really know what kind of animal the 10-horn beast is like. Its only real feature, its predominant feature, is the 10 horns that are on its head. What we know about these kingdoms in Daniel, according to Daniel, is that they are all different from one another. So the bear is not like the leopard is not like the lion, the lion is not like the 10-horn beast. Like, these are different from one another, it says. And of the 4th beast, which we don't really have an animal that's identified with it, in particular, a kind of animal, it says twice in Daniel chapter 7 that this 4th beast is different from the first 3. So I think, you have to operate with the point of view that the 10-horned beast of Daniel 4 is not like a bear, it is not like a lion, and it is not like a leopard. It is unlike each of those. It is unlike a bear, it is unlike a leopard, it is unlike a lion. Which means that when you get to Revelation chapter 7 and you see, Revelation chapter 13, and you see a reference to a bear, a lion, and leopard and 10 horns, with regard to the 7-headed beast, that you can't just interpret the 7-headed beast to be the 10-horn beast, as if Daniel is describing a lion, a leopard, a bear, and then a 10-horned beast which has 7 heads and is like a leopard, has the mouth of a lion and the feet of a bear. Because in Daniel, these beasts are all different from one another, including the 4th beast, which is different from the other 3. But in Revelation, the beast that has 7 heads, it has a likeness to each of the beasts in Daniel. So this, to me, seems to be and again, there aren't too many people who I think equate the 7-headed beast directly to being just the exact same thing as the 10-horned beast of Daniel 7, but some people do. And this is one of the reasons why I think that we can't really make that conclusion. We can't draw that identification. The 7-headed beast is not the same as the 10-horned beast, any more than the 7-headed beast is the same as the leopard of Daniel 7, or that the 7-headed beast is the lion of Daniel 7 or the bear of Daniel 7. You don't see a lot of people arguing that, oh, okay, this seven-headed beast has the feet of a bear, therefore it is the same as this bear beast from Daniel chapter 7. And in the same token, I think that that reasoning holds that you can't go, well, because the seven-headed beast has 10 horns, it's therefore the 10-horned beast. I mean, sure it does. It has 10 horns, but it also is like a leopard, but it's not the leopard. So what we have in the seven-headed beast is something that is intended to be inclusive of the beasts mentioned in Daniel chapter 7, but it is not identical with any one particular beast of Daniel 7, at least from the apparent information we're provided. So that's an important piece of the puzzle, because if you think that the 10-horned beast of Daniel 7 is the same thing as the seven-headed beast entirely, and that's just they're the exact same thing, then you might be headed in the wrong direction in terms of identifying this and understanding the historical progression, etc. So none of the beasts of Daniel 7 have 7 heads, not even the fourth beast. So this seven-headed beast is meant to depict something related but different than the any one of the 4 beasts of Daniel 7. So the other thing that I want to point out, which we did talk a little bit about last week, is that in Daniel's description of the fourth beast, he explains that it has 10 horns, and then he gives us some little bit more information about the circumstances regarding the 10 horns, that they arise out of this fourth kingdom, and among them, but after them, surfaces this little horn, which then subdues 3 of the first 10 horns. And what I want to point out is that that indicates that the little horn, the time period of the little horn and the 10 horns is different than the beast itself. And there's a couple of factors that make that point for us. One of them comes out of Daniel 2, which we're going to talk about here in a second. But there are some other factors that I want to continue to group in here, which will deal with, in part, how we historically identify these 4 kingdoms from Daniel. So let's talk about Daniel 2, because that's going to help with the identification. In Daniel chapter 2, it isn't Daniel that has a vision, which is what we have in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, and so on. But in Daniel 2, it's the main Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, who is the preeminent king of what's called the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and he wants to know the meaning of the dream. And so I'm shortening all of this, but eventually Daniel is the only person who's able to explain to the king what the dream said, what it means. And God reveals to Daniel what was intended to be told through the image of the dream. And so this is what we're told, that this vision concerns things that are to come, things to happen in the latter days, what will come to pass after the time of the Babylonians. That's according to verses 28 and 29. So everything from after the Babylonians up till what would be said as the latter days. So he says what the king saw was this great image, and it was this essentially a statue in which the head of the image was made of gold, and the upper portion of the torso, including the shoulders and the upper chest, are made, and I guess the upper part of the arms are silver, and then the belly and the upper part of the legs are brass, and then the lower part of the legs are iron, and then the feet are part iron and part clay. So in this image, we have 2 different components. One is the substance, and the other is the portion or segment of the anatomy. Those 2 things change in each segment. And so we want to know why this image is segmented into different portions of the body and into different substances. Those seem to be the most significant things to try to piece together. And so when Daniel gives the explanation of this, he says, well, this is what you saw. Let me tell you what God intended to communicate through this. And he says to Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold, in verse 38. So the Babylonian kingdom under Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold, which automatically implies for us certain things about what the segments of the body represent and what the substances of the body represent. After Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel says, another kingdom will arise that is inferior to you. Right? Silver is not as precious of a metal as gold. And he says, and a third kingdom, which will be of brass. So now we can begin to see that the lower you go in terms of the segment of the anatomy of the body is further forward in time. The head is the present of Daniel's day, and then the feet will eventually be the furthest distant future. And then it switches in segment to segment from gold to silver to brass, and that substance seems to signify the people group that are predominant in that part of the world, and with respect pretty much to the nation of Israel living in its land with a temple, and those nations' interaction with it. And then he explains in verse 40 the fourth kingdom. So we're counting kingdoms forward from the Babylonians. The fourth kingdom will be as strong as iron. And then it explains some other things here that we can connect possibly to some of the information from Daniel 7. And he says, and when you saw the feet and the toes, so notice that he mentions the toes here. He says the feet and the toes, which were, it's this one period of time, like it's just the feet and the toes. They're both on the same level, but it's divided between clay and iron. So we have two substances. This is a unique feature to that period of time, to the feet, that level of the statue, in that it's the only time where we have two different substances present at once in the same segment. And so the other interesting component here, which I think many people correctly connect to Daniel 7, is the component of 10 toes to 10 horns and the succession of kingdoms, right? So, we have here we have 5 different segments: the head, the chest, the belly, the legs, and the feet. And I've simplified that just to make it easier to articulate. In Daniel 7, we have 4 different kingdoms: the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the 10-horn kingdom. So that means that these 2 visions, one that is Nebuchadnezzar's and the other is given to Daniel, either they are completely different and they don't correspond in any way, or we have to figure out where the overlap and the connection and correspondence is. And so the last thing to mention for sure here in Daniel chapter 2 is that in the days of these kings, he says in verse 44, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and the kingdom will not be left to another people. And he explains this, that is part of the vision, that the statue was crushed by this rock that was cut, that comes down and destroys the statue, breaks it apart, and then that rock becomes a great mountain. And that great mountain, as it explains here in verse 44, is the kingdom of God, which replaces all of these other kingdoms that have come before it. So there's a time sequence of events coming here that begins with Babylon, and then it goes through the kingdom after Babylon, then the third kingdom after Babylon, the fourth kingdom after Babylon, which is the legs of iron, and then some period after that. And then the final period before the description of the coming of the kingdom of God is a period that has iron, which the legs had iron, and now the period of the feet have iron, and a new substance, clay. So there's I said 2 substances, and previously we would think that the substances are representative at least of the people group, the state of the monarchy of whatever nation held dominion, right? And so if we know that Babylon is the first in this series, we can make some assumptions or projections about what the other portions of the body and substances represent. Historically speaking, the Babylonians were immediately replaced when the Medo-Persian or Persian Empire came and conquered them and took over the realm, including inheriting the dominion over Israel that the Babylonians had when they conquered Judah and Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. And then under Cyrus, the king of the Persians, the first king of the Persians, in terms of that Persian Empire, they released the Jewish people to go back and build their temple. And then the Jewish people are back in the land with their temple, and they're struggling. And then at some point, the Persians end up in this conflict with the Greeks, particularly it becomes prominent in the time of Alexander the Great of Macedonia, who comes and then he overcomes the Persians, takes over their empire and inherits it. and then he sets up a kingdom. And so the history of Alexander's empire, some of us are familiar, is that he doesn't live very long after he accomplishes all this. He's very young when he dies, and his kingdom very quickly becomes ruled by four of his generals who take essentially different parts to the north, south, east, and west. Daniel seems to be describing the Greeks in Daniel chapter 7. If you follow the series, and in Daniel 7, also starting in the time of the Babylonians, starts with this lion, and then it goes to the bear, and the bear is raised up on one side, and then it has the leopard, which has four heads, and then the beast that has teeth, 10 iron teeth, I think, or nails of brass, and 10 horns. And so if we think about this, we can think, okay, 10 horns may correspond to the 10 toes, but that would mean that some component of this 10-horn beast is in the final days, whereas we would have a gap there, right? So if we take the statue and we take the from Daniel 2 and we take the beast from Daniel 7, we'll end up with, and I'm going to pull up a chart here that we've used to sort of show at least our understanding of how this would correspond between these two passages. And I'll go over the chart that'll help me kind of articulate. Let's see. Here we go. No. Well, we can do it that way. So this is a kind of a depiction of what Nebuchadnezzar sees in chapter 2. There's the statue with the head of gold, arms, chest of silver, belly and thighs of brass, iron legs, and then you kind of got this mixture down here in the feet.
So can I ask some questions about that real quick?
You can.
Yeah, so on that, on this particular image here, we see that each kingdom is subsequent to another, comes after, right? But they're not necessarily immediately contiguous, right? Like, so there's a period of time in between a kingdom, like this one says Daniel 6:12 to 5:39, and the next one starts 5:59 to 3:23, right?
Well,
So
yeah, the dates here are meant to be like sort of just representative of the period of dominance, but they're not, these are not like absolute consensus dates on when these kingdoms started or fell. I think
what they imply though is that it's not like day one it's this kingdom and the next day it's the next kingdom though, right?
Yeah, I mean, so the point that you may be making is that there's these sort of transitional periods or decades of conflict. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah. So then, if the head represents a particular kingdom, and then the arms and chest represent another kingdom, but separated by some amount of time, right before they get firmly established, then that would also maybe imply then when you get between the legs and the feet that
yeah, I think that's the difficult part, is that with regard to the first four segments, there is real like rub transitionally. So it's certainly between Babylon and the Median and Persian kingdom, there is not really a gap. It's not like the Babylonians go out of power and there's a vacuum, and then years later the Persians arise and they kind of take over. There's a direct conflict that between these two where the power flips from one to the other. The same is true between the Persians and the Greeks. There's that conflict that occurs that switches the dominion from the Persians to the Greeks. With regard to the Greeks and the Romans, there's similar conflicts, but there's a little bit more of a space there. I think people can talk about the decline of the different kingdoms that came out of Greece until ultimately Rome conquers those portions of the world ruled by one of Alexander's generals. But so we have kind of leeway to kind of ask, well, is this whole total picture going to eventually be absolute, like periods that are butted up right next to each other? Or one of the questions would be a question about gapping. Is there a place or opportunity for gapping? Is that kind of one of the things you were wanting to?
Yeah, so in the case of Rome being in the legs and in the feet, or iron being in the legs and the feet, right? Those representing two distinct periods of time.
They certainly seem to be intended by Daniel to be understood as distinct periods of time, but not necessarily telling us the proximity. Certainly if we use the first portions of the statue as a guide, we might assume that all of these time periods run right next to each other without any gaps. I think that would be a reasonable deduction based upon the history of what we know and what we see in Daniel as well. But there may be other factors that mitigate why the Bible is interested in particular periods or making these distinctions. And I'm going to argue that the real factor is the presence of Israel in the land, particularly in the land of Judea, around Jerusalem, including having Jerusalem as under their own possession, or at least populating the city and having a presence there with a temple that is active. So the gaps may occur when that factor is not present, because although, as I said last week, there's many empires and kingdoms of prominence around the world throughout history, the Bible's only interested in particular ones in these prophetic passages, and the commonalities that distinguishes the ones the Bible's interested in from the ones it is not interested in are their interactions with Israel when it's in the land, when Jerusalem is occupied by Jewish people and there's an active temple. So if there are gaps, or if there is continuity, that seems to be determined by the presence of Israel in the land or the absence thereof. That would be my hypothesis.
Hey, Scott.
Yeah, go ahead.
To piggyback on your point there, which is interesting because the Bible, one could argue, okay, well, the Jewish people, obviously they wrote the Bible, so obviously they're just concerned about their own history. But you had almost 10 tribes or whatever that aren't there, and yet we don't see a following or just, we don't see when they're on the dispersion, but when they're in Israel or in that connected with these areas, it seems like it's connected with this particular, these time periods. But there's a large segments of Jewish people or people of Israel that we don't know a whole lot about, and it doesn't the Bible doesn't track along when they went to Northern Europe or other places of that nature, and it follows them when they're in Israel.
Yeah, I mean,
but it doesn't seem to track.
Yeah, it does. And so you've got two hypotheses that could come out of a study of Daniel 2 and potentially out of Daniel 7, which is that what we know from history compared to the scripture indicates, that these are right next to each other, one after the other in history. If you just looked at the symbols, you may derive that there's no reasonable way to think that the legs are detached from the feet with some sort of gap space there. That doesn't fit the imagery. But the Bible is trying to use imagery, which is imperfect, to describe real things in history. And the factor about what is included may have to do with Israel in the land more than it does with the nature of whether there's a direct transition or a gap. So those are open questions that have to be answered, I think, by other considerations rather than just, well, a statue doesn't have a gap in it, right? But so let me take you guys over to the next one, which will show what I intend to be a correspondence between these different visions, both in Daniel and in Revelation. So at the left is Daniel chapter 2, kind of a reproduction of that statue concept that we were just looking at. In the second column is Daniel 7, where we have the lion, the bear, the leopard, and a 10-horned beast. So that's the sequence we have, just those four animals from Daniel 7. Tentatively, you can see that in the lateral or horizontal strata of this is the labeling of different identifications of who these nations may have been historically. Daniel 8 is included because it includes the same kind of thematic imagery of animals as nations with heads or horns as components or offshoots that come together to form or in the fallout of one of these empires. On the right, at the far right, is a sort of extrapolation of a seven-headed beast having components that map to Daniel 7, right? A lion head, one that has like sort of perhaps we might consider leopard-like components, and one that has like a bear-like component or something to that effect. But it's seven-headed, right? So each of the heads corresponds to conceivably, and this is certainly how most premillennial futurists have taken this, I think it's accurately, each head represents one of these different kingdoms from either the statue or particularly the series of animals in Daniel 7. And so there's some more complicated things happening in this chart at the bottom that I'm not going to cover as of yet, that deal with the additional components that Revelation 7 puts in. And you can see I've got some, tentative identifications of kingdoms out here to the right, which we're going to go back and cover at this point. So there's some components there that we have to keep in mind about the statue that are important regarding future periods of time. And as we try to connect these things, most Christians have connected Daniel 7, Daniel 2, and Revelation 13, I think, accurately. The things that we can kind of put together from all this is that there's only one period in this entire vision that includes two substances at the same time, which would seem to indicate two political powers that are of significance, biblically speaking. The clay and the iron present at the same time. There is a period of 10 toes, which could easily correspond to the 10 horns, which I think is going to be correct because the 10 toes are in the final period of Daniel's statue. And we're going to learn that the 10 horns, according to Revelation, are in the final period of the world as well. So that correspondence seems to line up. And so the repetition of iron from the statue in both the period of the legs and the feet is important because it shows something that doesn't happen elsewhere, right? The gold doesn't show up later. The brass doesn't show up later. The silver doesn't show up later. The clay doesn't show up earlier. But the iron uniquely is present in two different periods of time. That is significant because we see in Revelation 13 that one of the heads of the seven-headed beast, which was wounded, as it were, unto death, is restored back to political authority. So that would indicate something that had previously been a political power in the world that went out of power, that was no longer in power for a time, that is then restored to power. And so that idea of the presence of political, some kind of political power in two periods is in both the statue of Daniel, chapter 2, and in Revelation, chapter 13, with the seven-headed beast. So next I want to talk about the 10 horns and the little horn. We're going to skip this. We'll get back to it later. I had it next in my list, but it's going to just kind of bog us down. So in terms of horns, we can see from Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 7 and also Revelation chapter 13 and 17 that horns represent smaller nations or nations who together form a larger imperial power. So in the case of Daniel 8, we have a very clear, plain language explanation that the two horns of this ram that is in that vision represent the Medes and the Persians. And together, they come together to form this great empire that is either known as the Medo-Persian Empire or the Persian Empire or the Achaemenid Empire. So, depending on who you're talking to, they have different terms for it. But it's two nations that are closely related that come together to form and create that power. In the case of Greece, we know that again in chapter 8 of Daniel, we have a little horn. We have this horn that's the prominent horn of this Greece goat. The goat is representing Greece in this passage, and then it's broken, and then in its place grow up four other horns, which are scattered to the four winds. And so it's these different rulers that take over after Alexander the Great that are represented by the four horns. So in that case, it's four horns that come out of that initial Greek power base that are kind of the inheritors of its power, but not in its same potency as it had under Alexander the Great. So that's pretty helpful because then when we get to this 10-horn beast, we can say, okay, we have these options where the 10 horns can be outgrowths of an earlier power, and or they could be the initial smaller nations that come together to create a power. And in fact, I think it's both in this case that the 10 horns emerge from a previous authority, and then they give their power back to that same authority to form an empire, a single larger empire in the end times. And Revelation pretty much gives us that language directly. And so let me go down to Revelation chapter 17, where I think we can get that directly, where he talks about the seven-headed beast again in chapter 17, and he explains about the seven heads, that they represent both mountains and kings. Seven heads, seven mountains, seven kings. And it explains about the kings that there are five of them are fallen, one is, and the other is not yet come, and when he comes, he must continue for a short space. Now, that may sound similar in the English to what we read in chapter 13 about the head that was wounded to death and then is healed and is able to continue for 42 months. But the word continue doesn't appear in this verse in Greek in the same way that it is in chapter 13. In chapter 13, it does seem to mean like to pick up, continue, resume. Here it just means he will go on for a short space, like he just has a short space. So don't want to necessarily be confused by that. That won't be the operating issue or the main feature of what the sequence of seven here tells us. But when we get to verse 11, we see that the beast, which we already talked about the beast, he's an eighth king, but he's really just one of the seven. So again, that's that idea of iron in both periods, an authority that was previously in power coming back to power a second time. It's a unique thing in this sequence. And so he's one of the seven that had gone before, and he's coming around for another turn, creating a sort of eighth power or in the sequence. And then in verse 12, it explains the 10 horns are 10 kings, which have not yet received a kingdom. So this is really helpful. In Daniel, we're left with this fourth beast that has 10 horns. Now, we don't know it from Daniel 7 if the 10 horns mentioned there in that chapter are present at the beginning of that beast or at the end. And here we're getting to see that beast that had 10 horns, the 10 horns were not present in that beast initially, just like the 4 horns were not present initially in the Greek depiction as a goat in chapter 8. So here we're getting information from John, getting it from God, that the 10 horns from the fourth beast of Daniel are end times realities. There's something that exists in the end, not in the initial formation or an ancient period of this fourth beast of Daniel. There's something that emerges out of him that is present at the end times. And then it explains that they haven't received power at the time, but before John wrote this, they will receive power at one point with the beast, and they will give their authority and their power to the beast, right? So this is a circumstance, again, where we have horns coming together to form an empire. And so there are 10 horns that come out of this empire that was from a previous era, and then they're around. They don't really have any particular importance till they can really come together and give their authority to form an empire under the beast. And then so that gives us some really great information about circumstances under which that's going to occur, right? Because as I said last week, throughout this chapter 17, it explains that these kings, so we each have kings and kingdoms. You can't have one without the other. Here it's telling us about the kings. It's focusing on the kings. And it says that 5 have fallen, one in is, and the other is yet to come. And it says in verse 8 and verse 11, it speaks of a beast that was, it is not, and then it will ascend out of the bottomless pit, right? So it had power. It goes through a period where it doesn't have power, and then it ascends out of the bottomless pit to receive power from the 10 kings. And then in verse 11, it says the beast that was and is not, he's the eighth, and he's of the 7, right? Verse 8, part B talks about the beast that was, is not, and yet is. So there's this sequencing about this beast where not only does he ascend out of the bottomless pit, but he goes through a period of being in power, being out of power, and then being back in power. And his coming back into power has to do with the 10 horns giving him their kingdom. So in order to understand who this is, the beast that comes out of the bottomless pit, we just go back to where he's first mentioned earlier in Revelation, where we see that in chapter 9, we have this angel king that comes out of the bottomless pit. That's a very unique event, a very unique call out in chapter 9, verse 11. In chapter 11, verse 7, it talks about him. Instead of calling him an angel, it refers to him instead there as the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit. So we know who this is. And then here we have this reference to him in chapter 17 as well. So what we know about these 7 kings is that these are not the earthly humans that ruled these kingdoms. There's no return of Nero from the dead to rule over the Roman Empire, or Nebuchadnezzar coming back, or Caesar, or Cyrus, or anything like that. When the Bible's talking about the angelic powers that are associated with these kingdoms, that's who it's talking about when it talks about these kings. And so the power base behind each of these earthly kingdoms, ultimately, if you read through Revelation 13, but also present in Daniel and other passages like we read from Deuteronomy and in Ephesians, that the nations were ruled by or under the authority of different angels. Israel was God's, and these other angels, apparently all or most of them being satanic angels, angels who would oppose God and his plan, or who were wicked. They ruled the other nations, and they had these nations worship them as gods. And so when Revelation 13 explains that the dragon gives his power to the different heads of the beast, and to these different, or beasts, as Daniel and Revelation also use that term to talk about the earthly kingdoms, that the earthly kingdoms are deriving their power from the angelic rulers, these kings that are over them. And that's why Revelation chapter 12 discusses the devil and his angels in heaven as a seven-headed dragon with 10 horns, because the earthly nations and empires that are depicted in these chapters are associated specifically with that same structure, each of them having a ruler, an angelic ruler that is presiding over them. And so when Revelation 13 is talking about one of the heads that was wounded to death and then is healed and restored to power, and Revelation 17 is talking about one of these angelic kings that he is, and then he isn't, and then he is, or he was, and then he isn't, and then he comes out of the bottomless pit. That's his sort of death blow, right? That when he loses power, he goes into the abyss, he no longer has authority on the earth, and then he's released from the abyss to receive authority again through the 10 horns, giving him their kingdom, which he presides over as an 8th king. And so the resurgence of previous power is predominantly through, first and foremost, through the angel, more than it is through any earthly king or any particular earthly kingdom or people group. What is repeating is the angel's power. That's the repetitious part. There may be some geographic or structural or operational similarity to how he ran his kingdom the first time under whatever group he's previously associated with, and how he chooses to run his kingdom the second time when he takes power again. That may be very similar. The geography or the type of government may be similar. The character of that government may be very similar in both cases. But the power structure, the core, is based on the angel. This head of the dragon, this particular angelic head of the dragon, whose power is in the past, is removed, and then is restored. That's the healing of the head. So, as I said, beasts in these chapters represents earthly nations and angelic beings that are connected to each of these earthly nations. And so, yes, there were also preeminent human rulers of these kingdoms, but Revelation and Daniel seem to be interested in the angelic princes or kings of these nations, the Prince of Persia, Prince of Greece, and then we could extrapolate from there as well. And so that gives us a lot of information about what's going on here, and it presents a potential issue for us when we correlate or correspond all these different visions, because chapter 2 of Daniel has 5 periods with 5 or 6 different substances, right? Gold, silver, brass, iron, clay. So 5 substances in 5 time periods, with one of those substances repeating, the iron. Daniel chapter 7 only has 4 beasts. The 4th beast has 10 horns, which we know that the 10 horns are present in the end time. So they're a later development, a later offshoot. So that 4th beast seems to be present, presumably after the 3rd beast, and then also it has some kind of lingering power that will occur in the form of the 10 horns that are associated with it. I think that's through the angelic association. and I know Enoch's got something to say. I just want to finish the thought here. What we're missing then is understanding why there's 7 heads in Revelation 13 as opposed to either 5 or 4 different kingdoms as depicted in Daniel 7 or Daniel chapter 2. And so that is the part that I started talking about last week, and I want to talk a little bit more about that next. But I want to pause and make sure other people have a chance to say something. So Enoch, what were you going to add?
Yeah, I just had a question for clarification here, and maybe you can help me clarify this. It's always confused me, verses 10 and 11, about where it says the 7 heads of the 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and then there are 7 kings, and there's 5 are fallen, so we consider like Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, the Persian Medes, and then who would be the 5th one?
The Greeks.
The Greeks. Okay, and then they said there's one that is now, so that would probably during John's time, that would be the Roman Empire.
Yep.
In the 7th one, it says is not yet to come.
Yeah.
But later, the beast that was and is not even he is the 8th and he is of the 7. But is the one that is to come different from this angelic one that was bound or whatever? Because isn't the prince that comes back the one that is the number 6, right?
I think so. Of course, we're some of the things that are part of that calculation haven't been presented yet in this particular round of studying tonight and last week. But I agree with the conclusion. I do want to emphasize again that the fallen is and yet to come are in reference to the angelic kings. That certainly is relevant to the earthly kingdoms that they ruled over, but the focus there is on the angelic kings when it talks about that. But I do think it corresponds, as you said, accurately enough to particular imperial powers that were interactive with the people of Israel historically, and so we can begin to use this information to identify those kingdoms as you have begun to do.
Yeah, I just like my confusion. It says, and the beast he is the 8th and he is of the 7. Well, which one was he of the 7? Was he number 6 or was he the 7?
Yeah, so so I've got a section on that. I'd like to do a couple things first and then come back around to that question, because that is like going to become like the most or one of the 2 most important questions to answer, which is what power is resurging or being restored, which angel is being restored. That's important. And that's going to be, we're going to have to figure out how, what factors tell us or inform us of that. And it critical to that is also going to be involved in this question of what's the 7th one. So you have to kind of analyze those together based on the features and information you're given scripturally, because it will rule out, if you investigate one question by itself without information about the other, if you just look at which one recurs without looking at the information you have about the 7th, where you just try to identify the 7th without looking at the features about recurrence from Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel 7, for example, you're going to come up with an answer that may not work with that. So you have to look at those together and couple those so that you're taking those factors in. And so I want to do that, and that's going to become, like, I think, the preeminent question to going forward. So we're all headed to the right. I think the biggest question. So again, if head equals earthly empire or angel that rules that empire, then horn equals either a smaller outgrowth or even maybe a formational component, right? We said to help form that empire, as was the case in the Medes and Persians, and will be the case with the 10 horns. 10 horns also showing the other example as well. So when we look at the 7-headed beast, we can come away with, okay, well, if we can piece this together with the history of Daniel's visions and what the Jewish people understood and world history, then we can definitely do this. We can all identify the head of gold is Babylon, that's presented to us. And then we can look at Daniel chapter 7 and we say the Babylon is probably the lion. Daniel's talking about things, this vision during the time of Babylon. He starts with Babylon just like he does in chapter 2. And then we can sort of follow on from there, right? So after the Babylonians came the Medes and the Persians, that Persian Empire as it's sometimes just called, and that makes sense. That's the bear, right? In chapter 7, that bear is raised up on one side, which is like, well, why tell us that? But when we get this an alternate description of the Persians and the Medes in chapter 8, it's got two horns. One is higher than the other. So in both cases, there's the idea that one of these nations is superior to the other. It's higher than the other. And so both of those chapters are tracking the same progression, which would mean that the arms of silver and the bear and the two-horned ram are all the same thing. And then similar correlation occurring with regard to what comes after the Persians, which were the Greeks who took over from the Persians. They defeated the Persians. And in both chapter 7 and chapter 8, we have the Greeks depicted as either having 4 horns or 4 heads coming out of that power, the initial power that was under Alexander the Great. So the Greeks would correspond to the brass of the statue of chapter 2. And then we have the 10 horns, this animal that eventually has 10 horns. We don't know much about a description of its earlier period, its earliest or formational period, because the horns are descriptive of the power that's connected to it at the end times. So we really don't know anything about the features of this 4th beast in terms of its earlier formational period based upon the characteristics of Daniel, because it doesn't provide us any. But we know from sequencing that it would be the Romans that came after the Greeks that took over power and began to interact with Israel while Israel was in the land, all the way down to the 1st century, where, as Daniel 9 explains, there would eventually be a second destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. The first one occurred with the Babylonians, so it makes sense for Daniel to talk about start with the first one and end with the second destruction under the Romans. He also does give indications of a third destruction under a third temple that's built at some future point. But he explains that by talking about the people who are going to come and destroy the temple. And I want to point out, which I think I did last week, that it was common in from the Jewish 1st century before Christ and after, that the Jews understood this sequence just as we have laid it out here, including with the Roman Empire being understood as the 4th beast of Daniel. Now, the Roman Empire doesn't have any particular significance with regard to 10 nations that formed the Roman Empire. So there's, again, that fits with Revelation, which indicates that the 10-horn component is really an end times component that didn't exist at the 1st century or beforehand. And they're connected. The connection of the 10 horns to the earlier Roman Empire is predominantly visible through the prince, the angelic ruler that has power over both of them, and to some extent geography as well, and maybe also the nature of how he rules in a sort of dictatorial military power in that sense. So if we get that sequence right, then we've got 4 kingdoms named, but we've got 3 kingdoms missing, and we need to do some further work on this. And so that's where we can kind of put together some of the other historical stuff. And this 5 have fallen one is yet to come. Well, as Enoch said earlier, the one that is Rome. That's the one that's in power during the time of John's writing the book of Revelation, receiving the vision. So the other 5 have come before that. So that tells us something important, that Rome is number 6. Like, that's a really great piece of information that just solidifies a lot of this, knowing that the Roman Empire, which ruled at the time and presided under the time that John was having the vision. I mean, John is literally exiled to the island of Patmos, where he has this vision under the authority of the Roman Empire. So Rome is the 6th in the sequence. There are 5 before it which have fallen. Now, again, I'm switching to talk about the earthly empires, but we could do it in terms with the angels. The Roman angelic prince ruled at the time John was getting the vision of Revelation. Prior to that, there had been 5 other angelic princes who had ruled and who had fallen. Now, the word fallen here is one of 2 words that are regularly used in the book of Revelation and elsewhere to talk about satanic angels being cast out of heaven. So that makes total sense. It makes sense out of a number of things. First of all, in Luke chapter 10, Jesus says, I saw Satan cast from heaven as lightning. And I'm rearranging the words there, but everybody's, people will know that verse is there and can find it in Revelation and Luke 10:18. But when we get to Revelation chapter 12, we see that the statement that the devil and his angels aren't cast out of heaven until just a short period of 1,260 days before what appears to be the Christ's return. And so how can Jesus have seen the devil cast from heaven as lightning, fall from heaven as lightning, if the devils already are still in heaven until the very end of the age? And the answer is because there's not just one satanic angel. There is one chief satanic angel, but the Bible uses the word Satan or devil to refer to several of these guys, or all of them, or anyone associated with them, at times, without always meaning the devil. So Jesus can say that he has seen Satan cast from heaven, fall from heaven, because he has. He's seen 5 of that already, according to Revelation statement. And there would be another one that would fall, and then a 7th one that would fall. And so that's sort of what's happening here. And if you look at the language a little bit more closely in some of these passages, there's some additional connections. For example, Daniel chapter 10, verse 20, we have this discussion from Gabriel, the archangel, as he's telling Daniel, I was going to come to you, but I was prevented by the prince of Persia. And then he explains that he and Michael fought the prince of Persia, and then after that would come the prince of Greece. And the term for the prince of Greece he'll come on the scene, is the same word in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, as Revelation chapter 17:10 uses when it says the 7th king is not yet come. So Daniel and Revelation are using the same terms, that each of these satanic angels takes a turn and comes and rules over an earthly kingdom. And so Daniel lays out the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the ones that will come to destroy the second temple, which was the Romans. And then Revelation says, and there's a 7th one who's yet to come. Right? And Jesus states in John 14:30, he says that the prince of this age, he comes, like the prince of this age is coming. John in his gospel talks about that when he talks about, or in his epistles, he talks about the spirit of the Antichrist who is to come, that you have heard is coming. That's all the same language. So there's 7 of them. They each take their turn. So there's one left that is yet to come presently. The time John was writing, 5 had fallen. 1 was presently presiding over the Roman Empire, and there was another one who was yet to come. So John and Daniel are using the same language. So this helps us get to the question of, okay, which one of these angels is restored to power? What does that tell us about the empires? What about the 7th empire and the 7th angel? What can we piece together about that? So I'm going to say that, as Enoch did earlier, that I believe that we are led to conclude pretty definitively that the Roman Empire is the 6th, right? I mean, that's almost given to us from Revelation 17, verse 8 through 10. 5 have fallen, 1 is the present power, which was under the angelic prince of over ancient Rome, or ancient Roman Empire, I should say. We don't mean to specifically single out Italy. And so there's several points data points that lead us towards that conclusion, and none that really lead away from it or lead as strongly towards any other identification. Number one, this beast that comes out of bottomless pit, that was, is not, and yet is, and will ascend and will receive the power of the 10 horns that are associated with the 4th beast of Rome. That beast is identified as Apollyon. Well, Apollyon is meant to be, I think it's equivalent linguistically, and it has the same etymology as Apollo, who was the patron god of the first emperor of Rome, Augustus, who was known as the son of Apollo. And the Bible uses the term son of Apollyon, or the son of destruction, Apollumi, to refer to the Antichrist. So there's definitely this idea of the earthly king under this angelic king as the son of Apollyon, or the son of the destroyer. And so that correspondence is pretty tight, in addition to the sequence that Revelation 17 gives us: 5 have fallen, 1 is. And so the other is the connection of that this beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit, this angel king known as Apollyon, who comes out of the bottomless pit, his restoration of power comes from receiving the authority of the 10 horns. Well, those 10 horns are associated with the 4th beast in Daniel 7's sequence, which is the Roman beast. And that's certainly how the Jewish people understood it at the time of Jesus and John. So everything is pointing towards the angelic prince who presided over what was at first ancient Rome, again coming to power through the 10 kings in the end of the age. That's what seems to be going on. The geography of Rome and the rest of these kingdoms is kind of helpful, so we don't get unnaturally or unfortunately bogged down to particularities about this, as some have constantly speculated of a European antichrist who rules from Rome or from the European Union or something to that effect. I don't know. I don't think that the geography works that well for that conclusion for a number of reasons, both in terms of information we have about the Antichrist empire. Pinpoints a different area that's in fact north of Israel rather than west and northwest over to Europe. And there's several other factors to that effect. But let me go and take a look at some of the maps and just kind of show you guys this. This is generally taken. You can go to Wikipedia and get a similar thing. We're starting with the Assyrian Empire. You can see it in green here. Maybe I'll make it a little bit bigger. Where it kind of goes down to Egypt. So among the smaller of these empires, as we'll see, but it stretches eastward over to the Persian Gulf, just into what is the confines of modern day Iran, north to engulf a large portion of central and eastern Turkey and everything in between. That's the Assyrians. After them comes, we're going to talk about Egypt in a second, and then Babylonia is here represented in red, with the early Median kingdom at one point. So again, Babylon and Assyria are occupying very much similar portions. Babylon doesn't quite go down into Egypt the way that Assyria did. And so let's go on to the Medes and the Persians. This is the greatest extent of the Medes and Persian Empire after they take over the Babylonians. They go all the way over towards, parts of Greece and the very southeast tip of Europe and down to Egypt and all the way over towards India almost. And then Alexander the Great comes and he conquers that same area, starting out in the very westernmost portions over there where the Persians had gotten, and he sweeps across, takes everything back from them. And so you see the sweeping nature of where these powers start, right? Persians all the way over here on the east in Persia, they come over and go all the way west and all the way south. The Greeks then start all the way northwest here in Greece, and they sweep all the way south and all the way east. So those two have a great deal of geographic similarity. The other ones before them were much more limited, including the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians. And then Rome is a little bit more interesting in terms of what it's able to accomplish. And we could pull up a Wikipedia article here that has this as well. It starts out obviously as a smaller people group in central Italy, and then it spreads westward and eastward, southward to include this huge expanse. And at the height of the largest geographic reach of the Roman Empire, took it all the way eastward over towards sections of Iraq. So pretty far east in about 117 AD. And so you get this pretty big sweeping changes here in terms of where these countries start and where they go. And what I want to show you is what happens when, so after a certain point in time, Rome kind of ends up heading more towards the western portion or the eastern portion. It heads over and it becomes centered in Constantinople or Istanbul, Turkey, and then it becomes known as sort of Byzantine or Eastern Rome, and that continues for quite a long time. But that spans through the New Testament into the early centuries and afterward, where you can see that Eastern Rome, centered in Constantinople, was a very Eastern-oriented empire. It was known as New Rome. It was known as Eastern Rome. The emperors were known as the Roman emperors, and it was just as long, if not longer, depending on what factors you're counting for, that Rome was centered in Turkey than it was centered in Italy, which seems counter to our thinking, but that's just the way it goes. But I want to show you this map, which has overlapping, using all these sort of other areas that we've seen in the shades of blue. The darkest parts of this map show where these empires overlapped. And all of these empires overlapped in having rule of an area of territory that essentially runs from southeast Turkey, so like basically almost the eastern half of Turkey, southward through Syria and parts of Iraq, down to Israel, and almost down into Egypt. That's the part that they all have in common, with parts around that being common to more, and then parts further away being shared by less of them. So, and again, that geographic commonality coupled with the more important feature of Israel being in the land of Judah with Jerusalem, living in Jerusalem, and having a temple. Those are the two features: the geography, the history that's pinpointed by these books and prophecies, and then what we know about the importance of Israel being in the land. So when we ask, like, where's these kingdoms going to be at the end times, the information seems to point to that dark blue strip in the middle as the area where the 10 horns are going to come from. I'm short-circuiting that discussion right now, but that seems to be the idea of where this resurges. Really, that's where the Roman Empire's seat was, from Constantinople or Istanbul southward, ultimately, and then it just kind of dissipates, and then we'll have to wait and see where it resurfaces. But indications about Gog and Magog and the kings of the north component of Daniel 11, which point towards the little horn being out of that component that is part of both the Greek Empire of Seleucus, that inherited from Alexander, and also the Romans afterwards, who took that part over from Antiochus, one of the final Seleucid kings, and the Romans then occupy that area. So this little horn is growing up there, and that's presumably where the 10 horns are surrounding that. And then he subdues 3 of them, and the rest of them give their power, that all become his under the angelic king that comes up out of the abyss. So that's the hypothesis that we've put forward, is showing the idea that Rome is 6 in this number. The angelic king over the Roman Empire of ancient days is the angel that returns to power at the end times through the becoming the ruler of the 10 horns, and the sort of presiding over that. That leaves open the question of the 7th empire, the 7th head. And I won't get fully into this tonight. We'll talk about it more next week, but I just want to put the basic pieces on the puzzle here. The 7th empire or 7th head is not discussed in Daniel chapter 7. Daniel's really mostly focused in on the period where up until the second destruction of the temple, and then he does give us some information about a final 7-year period at the end of the age, but there's no particular large-scale discussion of the politics that emerge or that surround that particular point in history, other than through his other visions. He doesn't pay particular attention to it the way that he does with the other ones. So there's no beast given for it. Daniel 2 does represent it feasibly through the clay, representing a second period, right? We got the iron in both the legs and the feet. So that's the idea of an empire that previously was and then exists again. That's another reason why Rome is probably, and the angel of Rome is the one that resurges. If the angel is connected with the iron is his sort of identifying substance, then we have this idea that he's there at the time of the legs, which is the second to last period, 6th period, and then he's there again along with the clay. And that kind of works out. There's some other interesting things that I could corroborate. Let me mention, just in case I haven't done this effectively, why we place Assyria and Egypt as the first 2 heads of the 7-headed structure. It's not mentioned in Daniel. Revelation doesn't identify it, but if you go through the earlier experience of the Jewish people in the Old Testament, you see that we know Babylon is one of these empires that Daniel starts with. Prior to the time of Daniel, however, leading up to the circumstances of Daniel, were the 2 kingdoms that came before this. Israel's in the land. They've been in the land for a long time, since Joshua. They've had kings going back to Saul and David, and they are interacting with these other nations. And if you look at 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and 2 Kings 24:1 and also 2 Kings 17, you'll see that what's happening before the time of Daniel is the Assyrians at one point are threatening Israel, and the Israelites are turning to Egypt for assistance, and then the Egyptians come up, and they have power, and they have an alliance with Israel, and they're dominating Israel, and they take treasures out of the temple treasury, and they subjugate the kings of Judah in Jerusalem. And then the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar come, and they turn away the Egyptians, and the Egyptians never come up, and the Babylonians take the territory that the Egyptians formerly held up into the land of Israel and further, and they take it away from the Egyptians, and the Babylonians hold it. So it's very clear that the Babylonians, which Daniel is identifying for us particularly, are taking over that role from the Egyptians who preceded them, and there are certainly other places that indicate that the Assyrians were also in this position early on in this time frame around with the Egyptians. So whether you put Egypt first or Assyria first, they're both identified in these same terms in the scripture. There's a couple other factors that point towards their inclusion as well. Sometimes people think of Egypt in terms of the Exodus period or prior to the Exodus period. That may be somewhat relevant, but in reality, the beast concepts and the dominion over Israel component, which is featured in Daniel 2 and chapter 7 as well, are and throughout Daniel, in fact, are focused on Israel being in the land with the temple in Jerusalem. That's obviously not something that was part of the Exodus period and the period of captivity in Egypt, the servitude and bondage in Egypt. So Egypt is included, but for reasons I think that people don't often think about. So that gives us the first six. 5 have fallen. That is Egypt, Syria, Babylon, Persia, and Greece, and then Rome is at the time John wrote, and then we got some unidentified seventh one that is still to come. The thing that's important about the seventh empire is it has 2 horns. We'll talk about where we get that information from, and it also is the Bible's only concerned about this thing for a short period of time. Like its relevance to biblical prophecy when it comes into factoring into this is only for a short period of time, and it didn't exist when John wrote. So there's some pretty important factors there. It only is going to rule for a short period of time. It's in existence at the end of the world. It has 2 horns, which I'll again talk about why I get there, and it hasn't existed in the first century, and it has to exist at some point when Israel's in the land with a temple. Well, since 70 AD, there hasn't been a point in time when Israel's been in the land with a temple. So that really kind of eliminates almost anything that's come since Rome from meeting this criteria. We're looking for an end times kingdom that's only really important in this respect for a short period when Israel has a temple. Israel's only going to have a temple for a few years before Christ comes back. So that's really the period we're talking about, and that's what we're looking for, this seventh kingdom or empire to come, and the seventh angel who's going to rule it to maybe come forward. So we'll end tonight there. We'll pick up with that next week, and then what that means in terms of eliminating possible speculation on what the seventh empire is. And we'll talk more about the relationship between the seventh empire and the 10 horns, because these are 2 different things. They're both empires. I mean, that's the terminology. They're all heads. They all have angelic kings. There's 7 heads. There's 7 kings. They each rule a kingdom on earth. And we're going to see that we, in fact, have, as I said, a beast, an individual beast for the seventh empire, just like we do all the other ones, or at least the ones starting with Babylon, in terms of the second beast that's discussed in Revelation chapter 13, which has 2 horns. So we have a 2-horned beast and a 10-horned beast in the end times. They're both empires on earth. They both have angelic rulers. They're both present. They're both present at the end times. One is comprised of 2 nations that's only around for a short period of time at the very end. And the other is 10 horns that have a connection to the angel who ruled over the empire of ancient Rome, or that began in ancient Rome and then spread to ancient Turkey. And so that's kind of where we're at for tonight. So let me stop there. I know we've gone a little bit long, and then we'll do discussion and prayer requests after. So